Office Chapter 1. The Uninvited. The late May sunshine spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Blake Architectural Design Office, casting long golden rectangles across the polished concrete floor. The modern space, all clean lines, exposed beams, and carefully curated minimalism sat empty on what should have been a regular Friday. But today was anything but regular. Denise Blake stood in the doorway, her slender figure silhouetted against the bright light outside. At 53, she carried herself with a poised elegance that had become her signature over 2 decades as the second Mrs. Blake. Her blonde hair, expertly highlighted and styled in soft waves that framed her face, caught the sunlight as she hesitated before stepping inside. "Hello," her voice echoed in the empty office. She hadn't expected anyone to answer. The entire staff had been given the day off. Everyone was at Ethan's wedding. Everyone except her. The invitation had never arrived. Not that she had truly expected. 1. The tense politeness that characterized her relationship with her stepson had eroded over the past year into something colder, more distant. Still, appearances mattered, and her absence would be noted. Denise's Louboutins clicked against the floor as she made her way toward Robert's old office, her late husband's sanctuary, now occupied by his son. Even 5 years after Robert's death, she still thought of it as his space. The familiar ache settled in her chest, the one that appeared whenever she allowed herself to remember. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself, adjusting the Hermes scarf at her neck. Just get the papers and go. The tax documents she needed should have been filed in the basement archive, but her accountant needed them urgently, and she couldn't wait until Monday when the office reopened. Using her still valid keycard had felt like trespassing, though technically, as a 30% shareholder in the firm, she had every right to be there. As she rounded the corner to Ethan's office, she stopped abruptly. The door was ajar, and through the gap, she could see a woman she didn't recognize rifling through one of the filing cabinets. "Excuse me?" Denise's voice was sharp, authoritative, the tone she had perfected as the wife of one of Boulder's most prominent architects. That the young woman jumped, nearly dropping the folder in her hands. She was perhaps in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing jeans and a simple blouse entirely too casual for the Blake offices, even on a day when no clients were expected. "Mrs. Blake, I'm so sorry, I didn't hear. You come in." The woman's eyes widened with recognition, which only deepened Denise's frown. The stranger knew her, but Denise couldn't place her. "And you are?" Denise remained in the doorway, one manicured hand resting on the frame. "Maya Chen. I'm the project manager for the Ridgeline development." She set down the folder and extended a hand that Denise didn't take. "Ethan asked me to pull some files for Monday's presentation. I thought I'd be in and out before anyone came." "Bye?" Denise arched an eyebrow. On his wedding day, Maya's expression shifted subtly, discomfort, perhaps, or something more complicated. The clients moved up the timeline. "I volunteered so he wouldn't have to worry about it." How thoughtful. Denise's tone made it clear she found it anything but. "I need to retrieve some tax documents. I won't keep you." Instead of leaving, however, Maya lingered, watching as Denise crossed to the opposite filing cabinet. "I'm surprised you're not at the ceremony," she said finally, the statement hovering somewhere between observation and question. Denise's hand stilled on the drawer handle. "I wasn't invited." The words came out before she could stop them, more vulnerable than she intended. She straightened her shoulders. "My stepson and I have different views on family matters." Maya nodded slowly. "I've worked with Ethan for 3 years. He doesn't talk much about his personal life." "That's not surprising." Denise pulled open the drawer, scanning the neatly labeled tabs. "Ethan has always been selective about what parts of himself he shares. He speaks highly of his father," Maya offered, returning to her own search. "Robert was an extraordinary man." Denise's voice softened. "This firm was his life's work. And now it's Ethan's." "Yes," a single word, heavy with unspoken complexities. The two women worked in silence for several minutes, the only sound the soft rustling of papers and the occasional slide of a drawer. Denise found herself distracted. Her gaze drifting to the photographs on Ethan's desk, none of which included her, she noted. There was one of Robert, though, arms crossed, smiling proudly in front of their first major commercial project. Beside it stood a more recent photo of Ethan with his fiancée, now wife, Catherine, a willowy brunette with an infectious smile who taught art at the local high school. Denise had met her exactly twice. Both times, Catherine had tried to bridge the gap, asking thoughtful questions about Denise's charity work and complimenting her home with what seemed like genuine admiration. Denise had remained coolly polite, unwilling to give Ethan the satisfaction of winning over his wife as he never had with his father. "Not in this drawer," Denise murmured, closing it and moving to the next one down. As she pulled it open, I caught something unusual, a folder tucked at the very back. Behind the hanging files, as if intentionally hidden, curiosity piqued. She reached for it, noting the faded label, Personala DB, Robert Daniel Blake's initials. "Found what you needed?" Maya asked from across the room. "Not yet," Denise replied, absently, already opening the folder. Inside was a single sealed envelope. Yellowed with age, addressed simply to Robert in handwriting Denise didn't recognize. The postmark was from almost 20 years ago. With a frown, she turned it over. The seal had been broken. Someone had already read its contents. "I should get going," Maya said, gathering her materials. "Please lock up when you leave." Denise nodded without looking up. Of course, she barely registered the sound of Maya's departure, her attention fixed on the envelope in her hands. Something about it set off warning bells in her mind. 20 years ago would have been shortly after she and Robert married. Shortly after Ethan, then a sullen 18-year-old, had left for college, refusing to attend their wedding. With careful fingers, she slid out the letter inside. As her eyes scanned the first few lines, her breath caught. "Dear Robert, I've debated sending this letter for months now. You have a new wife, a new life, and I promised myself I wouldn't interfere. But what Ethan told me has been weighing on me, and I can't in good conscience stay silent any longer." Denise sank slowly into Ethan's chair, her hands trembling slightly as she continued reading. By the time she reached the signature, with deep concern, Margaret Sullivan, her world had tilted on its axis. Margaret Sullivan, Robert's first wife's sister, Ethan's aunt, the woman who had supported Ethan through his mother's long illness and death. The woman who had comforted him when, less than a year later, Robert had announced his engagement to Denise. The letter detailed conversations with a teenage Ethan, conversations about Denise that painted her as a calculating gold digger, a homewrecker who had begun an affair with Robert while his first wife was still alive, still fighting cancer, conversations that were entirely fabricated. Denise read the letter again, her initial shock hardening into something colder. These were lies Ethan had told, lies Robert had apparently received, read, and what? Dismissed. Believed. She looked around the office with new eyes. For 5 years since Robert's death, she had maintained her distance from the firm, allowing Ethan to take control, as Robert had wished. She had played the role of gracious widow, never interfering, respecting the boundaries Ethan established, all while he had constructed a narrative that vilified her from the very beginning. Outside, church bells began to ring, carrying faintly through the closed windows. Ethan would be married by now, celebrating with friends and family, or the people who had known Robert, who had known her, who might have been influenced by the same poisonous lies revealed in this letter. Denise carefully refolded the paper, sliding it back into its envelope. Then, with deliberate movements, she placed it in her handbag. The tax documents could wait. She had a different purpose now. Hey there, lovely viewers. This is just the beginning of our journey with Denise and Ethan. What secrets lie beneath this family's polished surface? What will Denise do with this explosive information? If you're as invested as I am in discovering what happens next, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you don't miss chapter 2. Also, leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you think Ethan was justified, or is Denise the victim here? I read every comment and love hearing your theories. Subscribe now for new chapters every day. Chapter 2. The Perfect Life, the Aspen Grove. Country Club glowed under strings of fairy lights, transforming the already elegant venue into something magical. In the warm evening air, laughter and music drifted across manicured lawns as Boulder's elite raised champagne flutes to the newest Blake Union. Ethan Blake stood at the edge of the dance floor, his tailored tuxedo and confident posture marking him as every inch the successful businessman he'd become. At 37, he carried himself with the same commanding presence his father once had. Though his features, the deep-set blue eyes and strong jawline were his mother's. Dress a sleek, modern column of ivory silk catching the light as she moved. Ethan's serious expression softened as he looked down at her. "Just taking it all in," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You've made an honest man of me, Mrs. Blake. About time, too." She smiled up at him, the genuine warmth in her expression making his chest tighten. "Though your Aunt Margaret keeps telling everyone she never thought she'd see the day." Ethan's gaze drifted to where his mother's sister sat, deep in conversation. With his father's old business partner, Margaret Sullivan had been the one constant in his life, through everything: his mother's illness, her death, his father's remarriage. At 62, she remained fiercely protective of her nephew and the memory of her sister. "Aunt Meg's just happy to see me happy," he said. "It's been a long road." Catherine squeezed his arm gently. "Speaking of family, double quotes, she hesitated. "I noticed. Denise isn't here." A subtle shift in Ethan's expression, a tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible clenching of his jaw. "I didn't invite her." "Ethan, it's my wedding day, Kath. I wanted to be surrounded by people who genuinely care about me." His tone was final. "Brooking, no argument," Catherine sighed. "She is still your father's widow. People are talking. Let them talk." He took a sip of his champagne, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Everyone who matters is here." Before Catherine could respond, Ethan's best man approached, clapping him on the shoulder. "The photographer wants some shots of you to buy the fountain before we lose the light." "Duty calls," Ethan said to Catherine with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll finish this conversation later." As they walked toward the photographer, Catherine's hand in his, Ethan allowed himself to relax. Today was perfect, exactly as he'd planned. The weather had cooperated, the ceremony had gone flawlessly, and Catherine was everything he'd ever wanted. Kind, intelligent, grounded in a way that balanced his more driven nature. They posed against the backdrop of the cascading fountain, the setting sun painting everything in soft gold. Catherine laughed at something the photographer said, and Ethan found himself simply watching her, struck again by how fortunate he was. "Just a few more," the photographer called, adjusting his lens. "Mr. Blake, could you turn slightly to your right?" "Perfect." As he followed the direction, Ethan caught sight of Maya Chen slipping into the reception area, looking slightly out of place in her cocktail dress among the evening gowns. He hadn't expected her to make it, given the errand he'd asked her to run. "Everything okay?" Catherine asked, following his gaze. "Fine," he assured her. "Just saw Maya arrived. I asked her to grab some files from the office for Monday's meeting." Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly. "On our wedding day, the Henderson presentation got moved up. It's a big client." He shrugged, as if it were nothing. Though they both knew the Ridgeline development could cement Blake Architectural's reputation in sustainable luxury design. "You're impossible," she said, but her tone was affectionate. "Always working." "Not tonight," he promised, pulling her close as the photographer captured the moment. "Tonight is just about us." Later, as dinner was being served in the grand ballroom, Ethan made his way to where Maya sat at a table with some of his younger associates. "Maya," he greeted her, resting a hand on the back of her chair. "Thank you for handling that today. I appreciate you going above and beyond." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, before she smiled. "No problem. Congratulations, by the way. It's a beautiful wedding, thanks." He hesitated. "Did you find everything you needed at the office?" Something flickered. In her eyes, yes, though I wasn't alone there. Ethan's smile froze. What do you mean, your stepmother was there? Looking for some tax documents, she said. He felt a cold sensation settle in his stomach. Denise was at the office today. Maya nodded. She seemed surprised not to be invited to the wedding. Ethan straightened, his mind racing. What else did she say? Not much. We didn't really talk. Maya studied his face. Is everything okay? Fine, he said automatically. Just unexpected. Excuse me. He made his way back to the head table, where Catherine was engaged in animated conversation with his college roommate. As he took his seat beside her, she turned to him with a smile. That faltered when she saw his expression. What's wrong? She asked quietly. Nothing, he said, reaching for his water glass. Just the work thing. She gave him a look that said she didn't believe him but wouldn't press the issue. Not here, not now. It was one of the things he loved about her. Her instinctive understanding of when to push and when to let things be. As dinner progressed into speeches, Ethan found his attention wandering. Why would Denise go to the office today of all days? Tax documents seemed plausible enough, but something about it nagged at him. His Aunt Margaret rose to give her toast, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. When my sister, Elizabeth, was diagnosed, she began, her greatest worry wasn't for herself, but for her 16-year-old son, who will guide him. She asked me, who will help him become the man he's meant to be? Margaret's gaze found Ethan's across the room. I promised her I would be there for him, but the truth is, Ethan guided himself. Through grief, through challenges, through building his father's firm into something even greater. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Blake Architectural had indeed flourished under Ethan's leadership, expanding from high-end residential projects to commercial developments that were transforming Boulder's skyline. Today, Margaret continued, as I see him with Catherine. No, Elizabeth would be proud. Not just of his success, but of the man he's become, principled, determined, unwavering in his commitment to what matters most. Ethan felt Catherine's hand slip into his under the table, a gentle squeeze that anchored him as memories threatened to pull him under. His mother's final months, the hollow feeling that followed her death, his father's rapid remarriage, as if 20 years of marriage could be so easily replaced. To Ethan and Catherine, Margaret concluded, raising her glass. May your life together be built on the strongest foundation: truth, respect, and enduring love. Truth, respect, and enduring love, the guests echoed. Drinking to the toast, as the evening progressed into dancing, Ethan found himself increasingly distracted. He moved through the motions, the first dance, cutting the cake, conversations with well-wishers, while part of his mind remained fixed on Maya's revelation. Denise, at the office. Today of all days. You're a million miles away, Catherine observed as they swayed together on the dance floor. The band playing a slow jazz standard. Want to talk about it? Ethan pulled her closer, inhaling the familiar scent of her perfume. Not tonight. Tonight is perfect, and I don't want anything to change that. She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. Okay. But remember what we promised: no secrets. No secrets, he agreed, the words tasting bitter on his tongue, because the truth was, their entire relationship had been built on a foundation of careful omissions. Catherine knew the outline of his family history: his mother's death from cancer, his father's remarriage, his father's death 5 years ago, but not the details. Not the things that kept him awake at night. Not the carefully constructed narrative he'd built to protect himself and his father's legacy. As the night drew to a close, guests began to depart, offering final congratulations and well wishes. Ethan and Catherine stood at the exit, the perfect couple, gracious and glowing, ready to start our new life. Catherine asked as the last guests drove away, her eyes bright with happiness and just enough champagne. Ethan pulled her into his arms, pushing away the unease that had settled over him. More than ready, they were scheduled to leave for their honeymoon 2 weeks in the Greek islands the following afternoon. Plenty of time to check the office in the morning, to make sure whatever Denise had been looking for hadn't disturbed anything that mattered. Let's go home, he said, leading her toward the waiting car. Home was a modernist masterpiece in the foothills outside Boulder, one of his father's final designs, which Ethan had purchased and renovated after Robert's death. It was a statement piece, all glass and steel and breathtaking views, as much a testament to the Blake legacy as the firm itself. As they drove through the quiet streets, Catherine's head resting on his shoulder, Ethan tried to recapture the sense of contentment he'd felt during the ceremony. This was everything he'd worked for: professional success, a beautiful home, a wife who loved him for who he was, or at least, for who she believed him to be. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Careful not to disturb Catherine, who had dozed off against him, he slipped it out to check the message. Unknown number, we need to talk about the letter. Ethan, tomorrow, 10 a.m., at the house. Denise. Ethan stared at the screen, his blood running cold. The letter. After all these years, his carefully constructed world was about to collapse around him, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. Chapter 3. The Confrontation. Light streamed through the wall of windows in Ethan and Catherine's bedroom, but Ethan had been awake for hours. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with contingency plans, each more desperate than the last. Beside him, Catherine slept peacefully, one hand tucked under her cheek, her dark hair spread across the pillow. He slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake her. In the kitchen, he made coffee on autopilot, his eyes repeatedly checking the time on the sleek wall clock, 7:43 a.m. Just over 2 hours until he was supposed to meet Denise. His phone sat on the counter, the message from last night still open. We need to talk about the letter, Ethan, tomorrow, 10 a.m. at the house. Denise. The house. Not his house, but the one where his father and Denise had lived together, the sprawling Tudor-style home in the historic district that had been his childhood home until college. The place where he'd learned to resent his stepmother with every fiber of his being. The coffee machine beeped. Ethan poured himself a cup, then leaned against the counter, staring out at the mountains visible through the kitchen window. The same view that had convinced his father to build here, nature's perfect architecture, Robert had called it. You're up early. Ethan turned to see Catherine in the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe, her hair tousled from sleep. Even now, slightly hungover and without makeup, she was beautiful in a way that went beyond the physical, kind of inner light that had drawn him to her from the moment they met at a charity gala 3 years ago. Couldn't sleep, he admitted, pouring a second cup of coffee and adding the splash of cream she preferred. She accepted it with a grateful smile. Wedding jitters, a bit late for that. Work stuff, he lied smoothly. The Henderson presentation tomorrow. Catherine studied him over the rim of her mug. We're supposed to be on a plane to Santorini tomorrow. I know. I'll just stop by the office this morning, make sure everything's set, then I'm all yours. He tried for a reassuring smile. Promise. She didn't look convinced. This doesn't have anything to do with Maya's message about Denise being at the office yesterday. Sometimes he forgot how perceptive she was. It was one of the qualities that made her an excellent teacher, the ability to read between the lines. To sense the undercurrents of what wasn't being said. It might, he conceded. I just want to make sure she didn't disturb anything. What could she possibly disturb? Catherine took a seat at the kitchen island. She's still a shareholder, isn't she, technically, but she's never shown any interest in the firm's operations before. Ethan took a long sip of his coffee, buying time. It's probably nothing. Catherine set down her mug with deliberate care. Ethan, we've been together for 3 years. I've met your stepmother exactly twice, both times briefly, and with you hovering like you were afraid she might bite. You refused to invite her to our wedding, even though everyone expected her to be there. And now you're clearly worried about her being in the office. She leaned forward, her eyes intent on his face. I've never pushed, because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. But we're married now. Whatever is going on between you two, I think I deserve to know. Ethan felt trapped between the truth he'd lived with for so long, and the facade he'd carefully maintained. It's complicated, he said finally. I'm listening. He glanced at the clock again. 8:12 a.m. He needed to leave by 9:30 at the latest, too. Reached Denise's house, on time. My father married Denise less than a year after my mother died, he began. The familiar story, the sanitized version, coming easily. I was 18, about to leave for college. It felt disrespectful to my mother's memory. Too soon, Catherine nodded. This much she knew. Denise was different from my mother in every way. Younger, more polished, more concerned with appearances than substance. The familiar bitterness crept into his voice. I never believed she truly loved my father. She saw him as a successful architect, a ticket to the social circles she wanted to move in. That must have been hard for you, Catherine said softly. It was. Ethan set down his coffee, suddenly restless. For years, I tried to make my father see what she really was, but he was, besotted. Couldn't see past the facade. And after your father died, she got her share of the inheritance, including her stake in the firm. I got operational control, which is what really mattered to me. Ethan shrugged. We've maintained a civil distance ever since. Catherine was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. But there's more, isn't there? Something specific that happened between you two. The clock read 8:23 a.m. Ethan made a decision. I need to go see her this morning, he said. She, found something at the office yesterday. Something I need to address in person. Concern flickered across Catherine's face. What kind of something? A misunderstanding from years ago. It wasn't exactly a lie. I'll explain everything. When I get back, I promise. But right now, I need to handle this before it becomes a bigger issue. Catherine looked like she wanted to argue, but after a moment, she nodded. Okay, just be careful. Family conflicts have a way of spiraling. If only she knew. I'll be back before you know it, he promised, crossing to kiss her forehead. Start packing for our honeymoon. I hear Santorini is gorgeous this time of year. 40 minutes later, Ethan pulled his Tesla into the circular driveway of his father's now Denise's home. The house looked exactly as it had the last time he'd visited, for the reading of his father's will 5 years ago. Immaculately maintained gardens, the ivy-covered facade, the leaded glass windows that had fascinated him as a child. His stomach clenched as he approached the front door. Before he could ring the bell, it opened. Denise stood in the entryway, dressed in a simple ivory blouse and tailored black pants. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, emphasizing the fine lines around her eyes, the only real indication of her age. Ethan, her voice was cool, controlled, right on time. Come in. He followed her into the formal living room, where nothing seemed to have changed since his father's time. The same antique furniture, the same oil paintings, the same family photographs. On the mantel including, he noticed with a jolt, several of him that he hadn't realized existed. Congratulations on your wedding, Denise said, gesturing for him to sit. Catherine seems lovely, from the little I've seen of her. Thank you, he replied stiffly, remaining standing. You said we needed to talk about a letter. Denise studied him for a moment, then crossed to a side table where a familiar envelope lay. I found this yesterday while looking for some tax documents. In your office. Ethan's throat went dry as she picked it up. That's private correspondence. Addressed to my husband, she countered, hidden in a filing cabinet in the firm where I'm still a shareholder. She held up the envelope, her expression unreadable. Do you know what this is? I can guess. His voice was tight. It's a letter. From your Aunt Margaret to your father, dated October 2005. A few months after we married. Denise removed the letter, unfolding it with careful fingers. In it, she expresses her deep concern about certain things you had told her about me. Ethan remained silent, his heart pounding. According to this letter, you told your aunt that I had been having an affair with your father while your mother was still alive. That I had manipulated him during his grief. That I had suggested putting your mother in hospice care earlier than necessary so that your father and I could be together sooner. Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the paper. You were 18, she continued. Grieving your mother, angry at the world. I understood that. What I don't understand is why this letter was hidden in your office, clearly read, and never mentioned by either you or your father. Ethan swallowed hard. It was a long time ago. Yes, it was. Denise set the letter down carefully. Almost 20 years of me wondering why you hated me so much. 20 years of trying to build some kind of relationship with you for your father's sake. 20 years of being treated like an interloper in my own marriage. Her composure slipped, just slightly. Did you know your father showed me this letter? When he received it, that caught Ethan off guard. What? He came to me, devastated, thinking I had lied to him about everything. For the first time, real emotion cracked through her carefully maintained facade. I had to defend myself against accusations of things I would never do, things you claimed I had done. I was a kid, Ethan said, his own anger rising. I'd just lost my mother, and I was the convenient villain. Denise shook her head. Your father believed me, thankfully. He confronted Margaret, told her the truth, that he and I met 6 months after your mother died, that there was never any affair, never any manipulation. She fixed him with a hard stare. He thought that would be the end of it. That once Margaret knew the truth, she would help you come to terms with our marriage. Instead, it appears she continued to nurture your resentment, and you continued to believe the worst of me. Ethan looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The narrative he'd constructed, the one where Denise was the calculating opportunist who'd taken advantage of his father's grief, had been the foundation of his identity for so long. To have it challenged so directly left him feeling unmoored. What do you want, Denise? He asked finally. Why bring this up now, after all these years? Because I found this letter hidden in your office on your wedding day, she replied evenly. Because for 5 years since your father died, I've respected your wish to keep our interactions to a minimum. I've stayed away from the firm despite my financial stake in it. I've maintained the fiction that we're a normal, if somewhat distant, family. Crimes I never committed. Your father would be heartbroken to see what's become of us, what's become of you. Don't talk about my father, Ethan snapped. You had him for 15 years. You don't get to claim some special insight into what he would want now. I'm not claiming anything except the truth, Denise said. And the truth is, your father loved you more than anything in this world. Even when you shut him out, even when you refused to come home for holidays, even when you barely acknowledged his existence in the years after we married, he never stopped loving you or hoping you would find your way back to him. Ethan felt a burning behind his eyes that he refused to acknowledge. Then why did he leave operational control of the firm to me, instead of you? If he trusted you so much. A sad smile crossed Denise's face. Because he knew it was what you needed, a purpose, a legacy, something that was yours and his alone, that I couldn't touch. She picked up the letter again. He also knew that someday, you would have to face the truth about the stories you'd told yourself. About me, about him, about your mother. What is that supposed to mean? Ethan demanded. It means your mother wasn't a saint, and your father wasn't perfect, and I'm not a villain. Denise's voice was gentle now. They were just people, Ethan. Complicated, flawed people, who loved each other, but struggled, especially during her illness. You didn't know them then, he said stubbornly. No, but your father told me everything. About how your mother pushed him away in her final months. About how guilty he felt for feeling relieved when she finally passed. About how terrified he was of raising you alone. Denise set the letter down on the coffee table between them. He told me because he needed someone to understand, someone who wouldn't judge him for his complicated grief. Ethan stared at her, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. Why are you telling me this now? Because you're married now, she said softly. Because you have a chance to build a life with Catherine that isn't poisoned by the past. Because I don't want you to carry this burden of hatred into your marriage the way you've carried it for the last 20 years. Chapter 4. The truth between Usathon stood frozen, his defenses crumbling under the weight of Denise's words. For so long, he'd clung to his version of events, the narrative that cast him as the loyal son. The keeper of his mother's memory against this interloper who'd swooped in to take her place. You don't know what you're talking about, he said finally. But the conviction had drained from his voice. Denise moved to a bookshelf and pulled down a leather-bound album he'd never seen before. Your father kept this. I think it's time you saw it. She placed it on the coffee table between them. Reluctantly, Ethan sat down across from her and opened the cover. Inside were photographs, dozens of them documenting his parents' life together. Many he recognized, some he didn't. His mother and father on their wedding day, young and hopeful. Family vacations, holiday gatherings. But, as he turned the pages, he noticed a shift. His mother's smile became more strained, his father's eyes more distant. The last 5 years of their marriage were difficult, Denise said quietly. Your mother's first cancer diagnosis came when you were 13. Ethan nodded stiffly. He remembered the fear, the hospital visits, the hushed conversations behind closed doors. What you probably don't know is that they had been struggling even before that. Your father confided in me that they'd been in marriage counseling for years. Why would he tell you that? Ethan demanded, defensive again. Because he needed someone to understand why he felt so guilty after she died. Denise's voice remained gentle. He loved your mother, Ethan. But their marriage was complicated. When she got sick, he devoted himself to her care, to being the perfect husband, partly out of love, partly out of guilt for the problems they'd had before. Ethan stared at a photograph he'd never seen, his parents at what appeared to be a hospital charity event. His mother gaunt but smiling bravely, his father's arm protectively around her waist. They looked like the perfect couple facing adversity. Together, had it all been a facade? Your mother was an extraordinary woman, Denise continued. Strong, principled, determined to face her illness on her own terms. But that determination sometimes made it hard for her to accept help, even from your father. Especially from your father. Something about this resonated with Ethan, memories of his mother refusing assistance, insisting on maintaining normalcy, even as the cancer ravaged her body. Of his father's frustrated helplessness. During her final months, she pushed everyone away from you, though you might not remember it that way. Your father was devastated, not just by losing her, but by feeling like he'd already lost her long before she died. Ethan turned another page in the album. Here was a photo he did recognize himself at his high school graduation, standing stiffly between his parents. His mother in a wheelchair, his father looking exhausted. He'd always interpreted his father's expression as indifference. Now looking more closely, he saw bone-deep weariness and grief. After she died, Denise said, your father was broken, not just from grief, but from years of strain, of trying to be perfect for her, for you. He blamed himself for not being able to save her. For every argument they'd ever had, for not being the husband she deserved. Ethan closed the album, unable to look anymore. Why didn't he ever tell me any of this? Because you were 18, and you'd just lost your mother. Because he wanted to protect her memory for you. Because he was afraid of losing you too. Denise's eyes were damp now. And then when he met me, when he started to heal, to find happiness again, you pulled away completely. I thought he was betraying her, Ethan admitted, his voice rough. No, and he knew that's how you would see it. But Ethan, your father waited. He grieved. He honored your mother's memory. Meeting me wasn't a betrayal, it was him finally allowing himself to live again. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing to reconcile this new information with the story he'd told himself for 2 decades. When I found out what you'd told your aunt about me, Denise continued, I wanted to confront you. Your father asked me not to. He believed that, in time, you would come to see the truth on your own. That forcing the issue would only drive you further away. So instead, he just let me believe whatever I wanted, Ethan said bitterly. No. Denise's tone hardened slightly. He tried, repeatedly, to bring you back into his life, into our life. Every holiday invitation you declined, every family dinner you skipped, every time he reached out and you responded with minimal effort. He never stopped trying, Ethan, never. The weight of those words settled on Ethan's shoulders. He remembered the voicemails, the emails, the awkward phone conversations that he'd cut short. The times his father had shown up at his apartment, at his office, attempting to bridge the gap that Ethan himself had created and maintained. After a while, Denise said, he focused on the one connection you still allowed the firm. He made you his protege, groomed you to take over, celebrated every professional success as if it could somehow compensate for the personal relationship you refused to have with him. Ethan stared at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. And you? Where do you fit in all this? I loved your father, Denise said simply. I supported him through his grief over losing you, just as he'd supported me through my divorce. I tried to encourage him not to give up on reconnecting with you, and I kept my distance when it became clear that my presence only made things worse between you. She leaned forward slightly. I never tried to replace your mother, Ethan. I never wanted to erase her memory or diminish what she meant to you and your father. I just wanted to be part of the family, a family that included her memory, her legacy. The silence that followed was heavy with 2 decades of misunderstanding and pain. Why show me all this now? Ethan asked finally. Why not after my father died? Because you weren't ready then. You were too angry, too determined to see me as the enemy. Denise picked up the letter again. Finding this yesterday made me realize that if I didn't address it now, we would continue this way forever. And with you married to Catherine, starting a new chapter, she trailed off, then continued more firmly. I didn't want you to build your marriage on the same foundation of secrets and resentment that has defined our relationship. Catherine deserves better, and so do you. Ethan thought of Catherine, her openness, her insistence on honesty between them. How many times had she gently probed about his family, only to accept his evasions without pushing further? How would she feel knowing their entire relationship had been built around his carefully edited version of his past? I don't know what to do with this, he admitted, gesturing vaguely at the album, the letter. The years of misplaced anger. You don't have to do anything right now, Denise said, just think about it. About what your father would want for you. About what kind of life you want to build with Catherine. She hesitated, then added, your father kept everything, you know. Every email you sent, every article about your work, every photograph that made it into the papers. He was so proud of you, Ethan. Even when you shut him out, he never stopped loving you. Something broke inside Ethan, then a dam holding back emotions he'd refused to acknowledge for years. I miss him, he said, his voice cracking. I wasted so much time being angry, and now he's gone, and I can't. He couldn't finish the sentence. To his surprise, Denise moved to sit beside him, her hand coming to rest hesitantly on his shoulder. He knew you loved him, she said softly. Even through everything, he never doubted that. Ethan looked up at her, really seeing her for perhaps the first time not as the villain of his constructed narrative, but as a woman who had loved his father, who had stood by him through years of estrangement from his only son. I've been unfair to you, he said. The admission costing him more than he would have thought possible. Denise's smile was sad, but genuine. We've both made mistakes. The question is what we do now. Ethan's phone buzzed in his piccata text from Catherine, asking if everything was okay. He stared at it, the reality of his present crashing back into the revelations about his past. I need to get back, he said, standing abruptly. Catherine's waiting. We leave for our honeymoon tomorrow. Denise nodded, rising as well. Of course, and an awkward silence fell between them. 2 decades of animosity couldn't be erased in a single conversation, no matter how revelatory. Take the album, Denise said suddenly. And the letter. Show them to Catherine if you want. Talk to your Aunt Margaret. Make peace with the past in whatever way you need to. Ethan hesitated, then gathered both items. Thank you, he said stiffly. As they walked to the door, he paused. I'm sorry about the wedding invitation. It was petty. It was understandable, given what you believed. Denise's expression was gracious. Perhaps when you return from your honeymoon, we could have dinner. You and Catherine, me. Maybe even your Aunt Margaret, if she's willing. The idea would have been unthinkable yesterday. Today, it felt like a first tentative step toward Something new. I'll talk to Catherine, he said. But, yes, I think that would be good. As he walked to his car, the weight of the album and letter in his hands felt simultaneously heavy and liberating. For so long, he'd defined himself in opposition to Denise, as the guardian of his mother's memory, against what he'd perceived as his father's betrayal. Who would he be without that armor of righteousness? The answer came to him as he slid into the driver's seat. Himself. Simply himself, man with a complicated family history, with regrets and hopes. With a new wife, who deserved the truth, or of it. He started the engine, glancing back at the house where he'd grown up, where his father had lived with Denise, where so many memories both painful and precious reside. For the first time in 20 years, he allowed himself to see it, not as a monument to what he'd lost, but as a place where his father had found happiness after grief. It wasn't a betrayal of his mother's memory to acknowledge that. It was, perhaps, the most honest way to honor both of his parents as real people. Flawed and human, who had loved him in their imperfect ways. As he pulled away from the curb, he felt something shift inside him, not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it, the beginning of a new story, one not defined by old grievances and carefully cultivated resentments, but by the truth, however complicated it might be. His phone rang. Catherine calling. He connected it to the car's Bluetooth. "Hey," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Everything okay?" Her concern was evident, even through the speaker. Ethan took a deep breath. "No," he admitted. "But I think it will be. I'm coming home, and we need to talk." "I'm listening," she said, and in those two simple words, he heard everything he needed. Acceptance, support, love, without conditions. "It's a long story," he warned her. "We have time," Catherine replied. "All the time in the world." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Blake believed that might be true. Chapter 5. New Beginnings. 3 weeks later. The Colorado evening stretched long and golden across the Blake Architectural Design office. Most of the staff had gone home, but light still spilled from Ethan's corner office, where he sat reviewing the final changes to the Henderson presentation. The Santorini honeymoon had been everything they'd hoped for. Crystalline waters, whitewashed buildings against impossible blue skies, lazy days exploring ancient ruins, and quiet evenings watching the sunset from their private terrace. But beneath the picture-perfect moments had run a current of something deeper, more significant than mere vacation bliss. On their first night there, sitting on their balcony with glasses of local wine, Ethan had finally told Catherine everything. The album and letter lay between them on the table as he spoke about his mother's illness, his father's remarriage, the narrative he'd constructed about Denise, and the painful revelations of the morning before their departure. Catherine had listened without interruption, her eyes steady on his face, her hand occasionally covering his when his voice faltered. When he finished, she'd been quiet for a long moment. "Thank you for telling me," she'd said finally. "For trusting me with this. No judgment, no recrimination for the half-truths that had characterized their relationship until that moment. Just acceptance, and a new depth to the already profound connection between them." The rest of their honeymoon had taken on an unexpected quality, not just a celebration of their marriage, but a kind of rebirth for Ethan himself. Each day, he felt lighter, as if shedding the weight of resentment he'd carried for so long. Now, back in Boulder, he was attempting to build something new from the ruins of his family relationships. It wasn't easy. 2 decades of entrenched attitudes didn't disappear overnight, but he was trying, and that itself felt like a victory. A knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. Maya Chen stood in the doorway, a stack of files in her arms. "Thought you might want these before tomorrow's meeting," she said, entering when he motioned her in. "The updated renderings from the design team." "Thanks, Maya." Ethan took the files, noting the careful way she studied his face. "Something on your mind?" She hesitated, then said, "You seem different since the wedding." "More? I don't know. Present, maybe." Ethan smiled slightly. "Honeymoon effect, maybe." She didn't look convinced. Or maybe it has something to do with your stepmother joining us for the client lunch yesterday. The lunch had been Ethan's idea, tentative olive branch. Denise had institutional knowledge about the firm's past projects that could be valuable for the Henderson development. At least, that was the professional justification he'd given. The truth was more personal. Denise has good insights, he said. Neutrally, she was involved in the early days of the firm's commercial division. Maya nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It was nice seeing you two actually talking instead of... She trailed off, apparently thinking better of finishing the thought. Instead of treating each other like hostile foreign diplomats, Ethan supplied wryly. I wasn't going to put it quite that way, but yes. Maya shifted the remaining files in her arms. Anyway, I should get going. My husband's making dinner tonight. Give Daniel my best, Ethan said, remembering the quiet, thoughtful man he'd met at the wedding reception. After Maya left, Ethan turned back to his computer, but found himself unable to focus on the presentation. Instead, his thoughts drifted to the dinner planned for that evening, the first time Denise would be coming to his and Catherine's home. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. Don't forget to pick up the wine. Denise mentioned she likes Barolo. Ethan smiled at the message. Catherine had taken to the idea of rebuilding family relationships with characteristic grace and determination. She's still your family, Ethan, she'd said simply when he'd hesitantly suggested the dinner, and now she's mine too. The elevator dinged in the otherwise quiet office, and Ethan glanced up, surprised that anyone else was still around. A moment later, Aunt Margaret appeared in his doorway, her expression unreadable. I thought I might find you here, she said, her voice carrying the slight southern inflection that years in Colorado had never quite erased. Working late as usual, Aunt Meg. Ethan stood, genuinely pleased to see her despite the complication. Her presence added to his evolving relationship with Denise. What brings you by? Margaret Sullivan, still elegant at 62 with her silver-streaked dark hair and tailored clothing, entered the office with the confidence of someone who'd been visiting it for decades. I wanted to talk to you before tonight's dinner, so she knew about it. Ethan had called her the previous week, explaining that he was trying to mend fences with Denise, inviting her to join them. She'd declined, citing a previous engagement, but something in her tone had suggested there was more to her refusal. I'm glad you're here, he said, gesturing for her to sit. I've been meaning to talk to you too. Margaret settled into the chair, across from his desk, studying him with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated him as a child. You've changed, she said bluntly. Since the wedding, since your honeymoon, Ethan nodded. I've had some ... realizations. About Dad, about Denise. About the stories I've told myself for years. His aunt's lips pressed into a thin line. Denise found the letter. It wasn't a question. Ethan wondered if Maya had mentioned it, or if his aunt had simply pieced it together from the sudden change in his relationship with his stepmother. Yes, he confirmed. She found it in my office the day of the wedding. Margaret was quiet for a moment, her fingers tapping lightly on the arm of the chair. I suppose you're angry with me. Ethan considered this. Was he angry? He had been initially angry that his aunt had never corrected his misperceptions about Denise, had perhaps even encouraged them. But the anger had faded, replaced by a more complex understanding of the dynamics at play. I'm not angry, he said finally, but I do want to understand. Dad confronted you about the letter, told you the truth about when he and Denise met. Yet you never said anything to me, even as I continued to believe the worst about her. Margaret sighed, suddenly looking every one of her 62 years. Your father did confront me. It was ... unpleasant. The only time in our lives he ever truly lost his temper with me. Ethan tried to imagine it his typically even-keeled father. Driven to anger by his sister-in-law's accusations against his new wife, he demanded I tell you the truth, Margaret continued. That there had never been an affair. That Denise had never manipulated him or suggested hospice care for your mother. That they'd met months after Elizabeth died, introduced by mutual friends. Why didn't you? Ethan asked, keeping his voice gentle despite the seriousness of the question. Margaret looked away, her gaze fixing on one of the architectural models displayed on a side table. Because I couldn't bear to see you lose the last piece of your mother. What do you mean? Elizabeth was my sister, Ethan. My only sister. When she died, it felt like part of me died too. Margaret's voice wavered slightly. You were all I had left of her, and you were so angry, so hurt by your father's because you truly believed there had been an affair, but because it felt like he was replacing her. Replacing your mother, Ethan started to protest, then stopped. Recognizing the truth in her words, his fabrications about Denise had come later, after his initial, more straightforward grief and anger. I told myself I was protecting you, Margaret admitted, but I was really protecting myself, my grief, my connection to Elizabeth, through you. She met his eyes directly now. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong even then. But grief makes people selfish, Ethan. It makes us do things we would never otherwise do. The office fell silent. The only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant noise of traffic below. I understand, Ethan said finally. I think I've been doing the same thing, using my anger toward Denise as a way to hold on to Mom, to prove my loyalty to her memory. Margaret nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. Your mother would have hated what I did. What we both did. Elizabeth wasn't perfect. Lord knows she had her flaws, but she wasn't petty or cruel. She would have wanted your father to be happy after she was gone. She would have wanted you to have a relationship with him, with his new wife. Ethan felt his own eyes grow damp. I think I knew that. Somewhere deep down, it was easier to be angry than to face the reality that life was moving on without her. Margaret reached across the desk, taking his hand in hers. I'm sorry, Ethan. I should have been the adult. I should have helped you accept Denise, instead of tacitly encouraging your resentment. I made my own choices, Ethan said. I was old enough to know better, especially as the years went by. Perhaps. She squeezed his hand once before releasing it. But I was your mother's sister, the connection to her you cherished. You trusted my judgment, my version of events, Ethan thought. Of all the holidays spent at Aunt Margaret's instead of with his father and Denise. The conversations where she'd listened sympathetically to his complaints about his stepmother, without ever challenging his perspective. The way she'd positioned herself as the keeper of his mother's memory, the true family connection, in implicit contrast to Denise's outsider status. Where do we go from here? He asked. Denise and Catherine are expecting me home for dinner in an hour. Margaret straightened in her chair, visibly gathering herself. I'd like to come with you, if that's all right. I think it's time Denise and I had an honest conversation. 20 years overdue. Ethan's eyebrows rose in surprise. Are you sure? It might be, ... Uncomfortable. Necessary things often are. She stood, smoothing her slacks with a gesture reminiscent of his mother. I've spent too long hiding from the consequences of my actions. It's time to make amends, if she'll allow it. 45 minutes later, Ethan's Tesla pulled into the driveway of his home, Margaret in the passenger seat. Neither had spoken much during the drive, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the front door, Ethan could see Catherine through the window, moving about the kitchen. The sight of her hair pulled back in a loose bun, wine glass in hand as she checked something in the oven, filled him with a profound sense of gratitude for her presence in his life, for her unquestioning support during these weeks of emotional upheaval. She's good for you, Margaret observed, following his gaze. Catherine, she reminds me of your mother in some ways, not in appearance, but in spirit, that same quiet strength. Yes, Ethan agreed, though I think she'd say, I'm the lucky one in this relationship. Catherine looked up as they entered, her surprise at seeing Margaret quickly masked by a warm smile. Margaret, what a lovely surprise. She crossed to embrace his aunt, then gave Ethan a questioning look over Margaret's shoulder. Aunt Meg wanted to join us, Ethan explained, setting down the wine he'd picked up on the way. Is that okay? Of course, Catherine said, without hesitation. I'll set another place. Denise should be here any minute. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Ethan felt a momentary panic. Was he really about to host a dinner with his new wife, his stepmother, and his aunt, who had been locked in a Cold War for 2 decades? Catherine squeezed his arm reassuringly as she went to answer the door. A moment later, she returned with Denise, who stopped short at the sight of Margaret. "Margaret," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I wasn't expecting to see you this evening. I invited myself," Margaret admitted. "I hope that's all right." A tense silence fell over the room. Ethan looked between the two women, one who had been his ally in resentment for years, the other whom he was only now beginning to see clearly. "I think it's more than all right," Catherine interjected smoothly, taking the bottle of wine Denise had brought. "We have plenty of food, and I've been hoping to get to know both of you better. Why don't we open this while Ethan gives Denise a tour of the house?" The suggestion broke the immediate tension, giving everyone a momentary reprieve to gather themselves. As Catherine led Margaret toward the kitchen, Denise turned to Ethan with a raised eyebrow. "This should be interesting," she murmured. "I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "She showed up at the office just before I left. She wants to talk to you, too. Make amends, I think." Denise considered this. "Well, I suppose it's appropriate. A night of new beginnings all around." "New beginnings," Ethan echoed, puzzled. A smile tugged at Denise's lips. "I was going to wait until dinner to share this, but I've decided to become more involved with the firm again. Not operationally, that's your domain, but as an active board member, perhaps helping with client relations." Ethan blinked in surprise. A month ago, this announcement would have horrified him. Now he found himself considering the potential benefits. Denise had connections in the art world that could be valuable for their cultural projects. She understood the firm's history, its founding principles. "I think that could work," he said finally. "We should discuss the details, but yes, I'd welcome your involvement." Denise's surprise at his easy acceptance was evident. "Really? I expected more resistance." "I'm trying to see things differently," Ethan admitted. "To build something new instead of clinging to old grievances." From the kitchen came the sound of laughter. Catherine and Margaret, apparently finding common ground. Denise glanced in that direction, then back at Ethan. "Your father would be proud of you," she said softly. "Not just for the firm's success, but for this. For finding the courage to change." The words touched something deep in Ethan, longing for his father's approval that he'd never quite acknowledged, even to himself. "I hope so," he said. "I've wasted so much time." "We all have," Denise replied. "But that's the past. Tonight is about the future." As they made their way toward the kitchen, where Catherine was pouring wine and Margaret was helping to bring dishes to the table, Ethan felt a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced in years. Not the driven ambition that had fueled his professional success, but something quieter and more profound: the possibility of healing, of connection, of family in all its complicated glory. It wouldn't be easy. 2 decades of estrangement couldn't be erased in a single dinner, or even in a series of them. There would be awkward moments, old hurts accidentally reopened, new boundaries to negotiate. But for the first time, Ethan believed it was worth the effort. As they gathered around the table, his new wife, his stepmother, his aunt, he thought of his parents, not the idealized versions he'd carried in his memory, but the real, flawed people they had been. His mother, with her fierce independence and difficulty accepting help. His father, with his quiet strength and capacity for second chances. "A toast," Catherine suggested, raising her glass. "To family past, present, and future." "To family," they echoed, glasses touching in the warm light of the home Ethan and Catherine were making together. And as the conversation began to float tentatively at first, then with increasing ISAT, realized that the secret hidden in that office filing cabinet hadn't been the letter itself, but the truth it had finally forced him to confront. The truth about his parents, about Denise, about himself. Some secrets, once revealed, destroyed everything in their wake, but others, like this one, created space for something new to grow, something authentic. rooted in reality rather than resentment. Outside, the Colorado sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, casting long shadows across the mountains that had drawn his father to this place decades ago. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new steps on this path of reconciliation. But tonight, in this moment, surrounded by the women who formed the constellation of his family, Ethan Blake was exactly where he needed to be. Home. Wow. What a journey we've been on with Ethan, Denise, and this complicated family. I hope you've enjoyed this story of secrets, misconceptions, and ultimately, healing. If you connected with these characters and their struggles to find truth and forgiveness, please hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss any of my upcoming stories. Each week, I bring you new emotional family dramas that will keep you coming back for more. Your support means the world to me, and I read every single comment. What did you think of how things turned out? Was there a moment that particularly touched you? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will touch your heart and maybe even change how you see your own family relationships. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to heal old wounds and build something new from the ruins of the past.